Just this, okay?
Okay.
And it's just gonna ask you a couple questions. How did this happen?
Tipflation.
More tipping prompts.
You prompted to that tip screen.
It's not an accident. It's part of the biggest trend in economics in the past 50 years. I read the papers and I talked to the experts, and I think I understand how these tip screens happen, who is to blame, and what the bigger ideas at stake really are. So let's try to figure it out. We're gonna have a research party. Okay, so what are we actually talking about here? It's kind of two different things. We're talking about the tip screen, which is this phenomenon where you go to a restaurant or a store, and when you pay electronically, you have an iPad turned around to you, and you have to pay a tip.
Credit card processor Square says almost 75% of remote transactions now ask for gratuity.
The second thing we're talking about is tip creep or tipflation, which is kind of a corollary to that tip screen. It's the idea that suddenly everything has more tips associated with it, and nobody really understands why.
You've interacted with no human at all in the course of the transaction.
Tip history, that is really interesting too. I want to show you some of that. But before I clutter up my new desk with that, let me show you my new desk. That's because the sponsor of today's video is Branch. Okay, so the reason I jumped at the opportunity to do this ad is that, I love having another beautiful surface to feature in my videos. And this wood grain desktop is awesome. I've got the Duo standing desk though, and it's not just for aesthetics, even though that was what drew me to this. First, it lets you stand and sit just at the touch of a button. I'm standing now. Yeah, I'm a standing desk type of person, and being able to adjust up and down during the day, it gives me more energy for sure. There are also some cool aesthetic things to this desk. There's a cool little drawer. There's a desk attachment. There's a hook. There's all sorts of accessories you can use to kit out your desk and make it right for your workflow. Even stuff like the balance board that I've got under my desk here that I can stand on. If you want to try Branch out, I've got a link down in the description. There should be a QR code floating around. Try out a desk or an ergonomic chair and kind of start off your work year right with Branch. So thank you to them for supporting the video. Let's get to it. All right, so I do want to go through some of the key tip history, including this amazing edition of Life magazine, because I think it's relevant to understand how tipping got the way it is today. This article is about the implications of tipping in America. It's from 1947, and it includes these polls. Do you approve or disapprove of the practice of tipping by and large? 68% approved, 27% disapproved. That ain't nothing. If the service workers were given fair wages for their work, do you think that tipping should be eliminated? And then it flips. 70% of people said yes. If they got fair wages, it should be flipped. And people have always felt mixed about the reasons that they tip. So remember, 1947 poll, 38% said that they thought it was good incentive to get good service. 34% right here were afraid of disapproval. It started as a European custom, and Americans thought that it was bizarre and absurd for a really long time. There were actually anti-tipping laws in the United States. This paper is about one that was overturned. This is a 1916 book about tipping, and as you can tell by the title, The Itching Palm, a study of the habit of tipping in America. It is clearly anti-tipping, and that was probably a more common sentiment in 1916. But you can just look at the table of contents here. The main places where it happened was in hotels and then also in railroads, in sleeping cars. A lot of people point first to porters on trains because that was a largely black labor force. And they say this is the reason that tipping emerged, because it was used as a means to kind of control that labor force and not pay them fair wages. I want to underscore that this was a known Pullman Porter issue. This is from a pamphlet that they were using to try to organize their labor more. And they note that tipped wages were a significant part of the wages. So really, these porters were working almost entirely for tips. which left them at the discretion of a group of largely white patrons. So I think that's definitely a valid theory, but there's other stuff going on.
Pullman Porter begins to change seats into bed.
Like in this 1916 book, they list a ton of different occupations, including housekeepers, janitors, porters, but also rubbish collectors, waiters, and garbage men. So around the same time that this train class was emerging, restaurants were also becoming more of a thing. People felt so awkward about these tipping customs that they even invented new ways to get around them. Let me show you something called the servidor. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. The servidor was this little thing that you could install kind of in front of your hotel room door, and everyone who would come and give you services at your hotel, normally they would be coming and they'd try to get a tip, and people were so uncomfortable with this, but the idea is this is the guy inside his hotel room, and so there's like a door, and then there's this little compartment in between this interior door and the outer door of the hotel room, and that's just so that guests can go to their inner door and get something from inside the compartment without having to see or make contact with the person bringing them their clothes or their polished shoes or even their food, because it like lives in this secret compartment in between the two doors. It basically shows that as these anti-tipping laws failed and tipping became more common in the United States, it just became ingrained as a part of the culture. And then you eventually had tipped wage laws, which allow employers to pay employees less money if they make their wages primarily through tips. This had the secondary effect of kind of solidifying tips as a thing in the United States, which is not what happened in Europe or in other countries. This is from 1946. Tipping. The old thin dime isn't what it used to be. A national nuisance should be eliminated. So Life magazine, the most popular magazine in the entire United States of America, in a very mainstream magazine. I mean, look at this. Welded water gadgets. Who wouldn't want that? In 1946, they come out and they say tipping is a disgrace and they want to get rid of it, but they can't. But then you get to the second half of the 20th century when you get the big intellectual revolution that would change tipping again and lead to the tipflation and tip screens that we have today.
It is really one of this year's laureates who paved the way for the present research in behavioral economics.
So now we're getting to the behavioral economics stuff, and this is where Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman come in.
Intuition is also prone to some systematic biases and errors.
You've got this book right here by Michael Lewis about their friendship, and then Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman himself. Honestly, I would probably recommend this one as the more fun read, but either of them give you a primer on behavioral economics, which is kind of the discipline that influences this tip creep and tipflation and tip screens and all of that.
A few general principles help bridge the gap between psychology and economics. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm here and I want to look at judgment under uncertainty, heuristics, and biases. The point of all these is to show that economic decisions are not these purely rational things. They are squishy social things, which relates directly to tipping. The first thing I want to talk about is anchoring. I'm going to turn on this random spinner and then I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, now I want to ask you, what percentage of countries in the United Nations do you think are African countries? Got it locked in? Chances are you are anchored around that 34 that showed up, even though it was totally at random. But Tversky and Kahneman found that when a spinner showed 10, people were much more likely to guess 25%. But when the spinner showed 65, people were much more likely to guess 45%. 34 is actually pretty close to the real answer, which is 28%. So I think we're all geopolitical geniuses now. And you can see how this totally relates to tip screens, right? Because you are anchored at these suggested values that you see initially. You think that this is the right thing, even though you've just seen it on a random screen. I want to give you another example too, because it's a fun one. Two groups were given these two math problems and asked to solve them, but not with enough time to actually multiply out all the numbers. The ones that got sequence A, where it starts with 1, they guessed that it added up to 512. The one that got the sequence that started with 8, i.e. the bigger number, They guessed that it ended up at 2,250. They each multiplied maybe the first 3 numbers to each other, and then they had to kind of guess at the rest. So the group that had the lower number to start with was anchored at this lower number idea, whereas the group with the higher number was anchored at this higher number idea. And just as crucially, they were both like way off. The actual answer is 40,320 for these. So both of these groups behaved irrationally, but they were anchored to the beginning of what their problem set showed. And this totally relates to tip screens and tipping, because you are anchored to those suggested prices for the tips, whether it's in dollar amounts or percentages. The big point that Tversky and Kahneman are making is that people are not always hard number crunchers. They respond to anchoring and to framing, and that is exactly the case when we encounter one of those tip screens. So this becomes a really influential way of thinking about the world, of understanding that people aren't entirely rational all the time. It's influential. Kahneman wins that Nobel Prize in 2002, and behavioral economics becomes this whole branch of economic thinking. And that leads to another influential book that would filter throughout government and business as well. Okay, so this book right here, Nudge, it is the continuation of economic evolution to understand how people actually act. And there's 2 crucial things. First, it helps us further explain tipflation and tip creep. And secondly, it really influenced the way that people and businesses think about running their operations efficiently. Y'all told me I have to get these Japanese highlighters. They love this concept that they call libertarian paternalism. What do you guys think? Do you like the Japanese highlighters? I think it looks good. I mean, you know. So libertarian paternalism. What does that mean? It means that they want to give people the freedom to make choices, but they want to put the right choices in front of people. There's libertarianism, which is the freedom, but there's also paternalism, which is shaping those choices in a very careful way. Let's even draw it back to the tip screen. If you want people to tip, you give them the choice of what to tip, and you even give them the option to click custom tip or no tip. But the paternalism is kind of showing them what you think they should tip in the first place, whether it's 15%, 20%, 25%, or even higher. So this is part of choice architecture, right there. The analogy that they have is a building. An architect doesn't tell you where to go in the building, but the hallways only go to certain rooms. That is the same idea here. And that choice architecture can face all sorts of different choices that we make within that libertarian paternalism framework. The idea is that small changes can be a big deal. So the example that they have here, they show Lakeshore Drive in Chicago and how the lines along the road get closer together as the curve gets more dangerous. The idea is that this will subtly nudge you into making a different decision. They also have a really egregious example from an election ballot in 1938. Notice how the yes vote is way, way bigger than the no vote. That is nudging you to vote for yes instead of voting for no. And honestly, this reminds me a little bit of the default tips on a tip screen. The other point that they emphasize is that organ donation rates change vastly if you opt in or opt out. These are the rates in countries that had you opt in to donate your organs, and these are the donation rates in countries that had you opt out from donating your organs. So simply presenting that choice changed the outcome almost entirely. And when you see this chart, I want you to actually think once again of the tip screen, because it is the exact same principle at work. Tips can rise if they become the default, the same way that organ donations will rise if they become the default. And the important thing about Nudge is not just that it is tracking the way that people act, but it's influencing it. There were tons of so-called nudge units opened in governments around the world to improve public policy outcomes using the kind of choice architecture and behavioral economic ideas that Thaler and Sunstein propounded, but also Kahneman and Tversky before them.
We need these helpful nudges now more than ever.
Imagine being in Silicon Valley in 2008 and learning about the power of nudges from a best-selling book. You would want to implement this into your business. And that is exactly what electronic transaction services did. That's why I talked to 2 people about it.
This paper looks at a natural experiment, something that happened in the real world, and we are able to look at how does changing the defaults change behavior in the tipping domain, in particular, the frequency in which people select default options, but also how the manual tip amount, so people punching in numbers, changes as well.
Basically, there was data on these 2 cab companies and their default tip screens, including time and destinations. One company also raised those defaults to keep up with the competition, and fares shot up as a result.
The main take home is like people are way influenced by defaults.
Yeah.
These decision frameworks or, the context of the choice and things that we think wouldn't influence our decisions are actually being influenced. I hypothesize that there's multiple mechanisms. One is this social norm mechanism. If you've never been to New York City before, you're not an American, you don't know what tipping is, you're going to just go with the defaults because you think that's what the social norm is. And, people prefer generally to conform to the social norm. So there's this social norm mechanism where whatever you present on the default, that's going to be interpreted as a social norm.
And so just to put a point on it, I just want to make sure that I describe it right in the video.
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, that's literally like somebody from Georgia's going to Times Square and they're like, oh, I guess they tip 25% here in New York City. Like, it's like that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And like you've mentioned, or, in my paper, the way I try to tease that apart is, where do we think these people who are less familiar are traveling to, and the nice thing about this data is so granular, you literally have the geo coordinates of where people are being picked up and dropped off, and you can map that onto what you think are very touristy destinations, things like Coney Island and Times Square. The other mechanism is what you think in terms of cognitive cost. So, these tips are in percentages. Everyone, you get your bill and you know that, okay, I should tip around this percentage. You have to calculate, what is this? You can always choose to just forego that and choose one of these options, right? And that's a mechanism that we would say is cognitively costly to make this computation. And you can avoid that just by selecting one of these defaults. And what I hypothesize in the paper is that, cognitive cost is not static and change over time. Who is facing more cognitive costs? And, a natural idea is, well, how about people tired and late at night, or maybe they've had a few drinks and they're just like, I'm not going to think about computing percentages and caring about it. I'm just going to go with the default. And that's the intuition of looking at late night fares and seeing that, for the subset of people, they're going to shift away from the defaults because the defaults are higher, but the shift away is not as pronounced as, say, other rides.
I talked to Dario, who visited a fast casual chain, and he got data on how tipping amounts changed according to which bucket of transactions people were in.
I realized that, on a $3 coffee, I was getting tip suggestions sometimes of, do you want to tip 60 cents on this? But other times it was on the $3 coffee, do I want to tip $1, $2, or $3? And so I started doing research on, it really was around tip screens. And it really kind of 2 psychological phenomenons. One is the anchoring effect, where if you ask someone to do something, they're more not likely to do that necessarily, but get closer to it. And then 2 is default options, where if I ask you how much you want to tip, you're more likely to kind of be all over the place. Default options, though, even though the choice set is the same, you can pick anything that you want. You're more likely to select one of those 3 defaults.
You were able to actually get some data from a fast casual restaurant.
I just think historically we used to tip in restaurants where people would come to you. They would give you a service. Fast casual is they'll prepare it, but you kind of, you then take it, you get your fork and knife, you dispose of your food. So there isn't as much of that service other than the preparation. Basically, for orders that were under $10, they put $1, $2, and $3 on the screen. And then for orders that were over $10, they put the 3% suggestions. You had this arbitrary cutoff in terms of price. People are more likely to anchor towards the bottom value. $1 out of $10 is about 10% in the lower end. But we had this bottom value of 15%, the higher study. And so they actually increased how much they received as a restaurant at that $10 threshold, just because their lower anchored value was 15% instead of the 10% or $1 that they were showing. Even though they did literally nothing else in terms of the service, I just thought it was a fascinating finding where, restaurants were able, this restaurant specifically was able to increase the tips. And the one other finding I'll say is like, $1, $2, $3, like people are saying no, they're not selecting other and including like 150 or, right. $1.8, whatever it may be, right? Yeah. Say the 15, 20, 25%, I would say, fewer people select those three, but it's still a high percentage. People are like, lazy is one way to put it, complacent. Like they want to just do the thing that has the least energy required.
So all this shows us that tip creep and tipflation, it lines up perfectly with these behavioral economics trends. People figured out a new way to increase revenue. And so we're the ones who are tipping a lot more. So who do we blame and how do we change it? I want to go ahead and make some thumbnails. So if you don't know, YouTube provides a tool that lets you test 3 different thumbnails in 3 different titles. I decided to make a range for this video. One that was totally straightforward, one that was somewhere in the middle, and one that was extreme. You know which thumbnail won. This really helped me clarify who to blame for tip creep. In the thumbnail situation, it's clearly wrong to blame the person clicking because they don't get to see all the options and they don't choose it. So I can't blame you for which thumbnail ends up winning. I also don't think it's fair to blame YouTube in this situation because they're simply providing me a tool that allows me to test minute different options. I am the choice architect in this situation. I am the one whose values decide what thumbnails and what titles I want to use to present this video to you. And so I think that the blame should rest on me. We have to blame the choice architects, which are the owners of these businesses. They're the ones who are responsible for it. It is the choice architects, the ones who are making the decisions, that have to decide if they have certain values or if they're going to let the tip creep up again. Hey, that is it for this one. Thank you for being here and watching. Thought I might try this as a research party. I do this series on shorts, and I thought it would be fun to do in a long video. Let me know if you have any topics that you want me to look into. I'm looking for stories that just are rich and require a lot of historical research or academic research. That's where the meat of the story is, and that's what qualifies to me. If you haven't been here before, over on Patreon, I have a totally free newsletter. More than 5,300 people subscribe right now. And that newsletter lets you know when a video comes out, and it also gives you an extra article about the topic that I couldn't really fit into the video proper. And so I want to focus on the work of economist John List, who's done a lot about philanthropy, which to me is kind of lateral to this tipping issue. It's a little bit different, but a little similar, and how fitting that it would be on Patreon, right? So I want to get into that, what he learned about philanthropy and how it relates to a lot of the philanthropic efforts that you see today. Hop on over there, spark your curiosity, and check that out. That's one of his tips. So yeah, spoiler alert there. But yeah, go ahead and check that out. It's free to sign up for. Otherwise, thank you for being here, and I will see you next time.